Thank you. I think each talk has just shy of 30 minutes, brutto, as we say in Hebrew. In other words, if you speak for that long, there won't be time for questions. If you speak a little less, there will be time for questions. And I'd like, without further ado, to call upon Professor Ishay Rosen-Zvi, Professor of Talmud at the Department for Hebrew Culture Studies, who will be talking his perspective on Jesus in Judaism, will be to talk about Paul and the Gentiles. Ishay.
Thank you, Martin and Gidi, for inviting me to this wonderful chavruta. And you should have. Okay, I'll try. Okay, it's warming up. It's warming up. Don't worry. Okay. Paul managed pretty well without a mic, so hopefully. Okay. You should have handouts. There should be more coming up. Try to catch them because it's pretty complicated anyway. So without it will be even worse. What I'm going to present today is a part of a chapter in a much larger project that I'm conducting with Professor Adi Ophir from Tel Aviv and Brown, a political philosopher. And we're trying to think together on the genealogy of the Goy, the Gentile, if you will. And this is basically part of my share in this project, the more historical, philological share. If you were here yesterday at the Gilman, you could hear some of his share, the more critical, philosophical, contemporary share, and then you could think how to, how to combine these two parts together. We're still figuring out how to do that. Okay, so now for my share. This paper addresses one aspect of the story of the birth of the Goy, its transformation from the biblical meaning of people to the rabbinic non-Jew. I begin by presenting an outline of the genealogy of the Goy as a word and a concept from the Bible to rabbinic literature, and then focus on one chapter in this genealogy, the meaning and use of ethne in Paul's epistles. In contrast to the scholarly consensus, according to which Paul simply borrows this binary distinction between Jews and ethne from Jewish tradition, we claim that despite scattered cases where Goy is used to refer to indefinite groups of individuals, no such tradition existed, and that Paul's ethne preceded the Tanaitic Goy in consolidating the binary division between Jews and their others, and may have contributed, in fact, to the constitutive role which the term plays in Tanaitic early rabbinic discourse. Despite, or perhaps because, of the ongoing presence of the Goy in Jewish discourses since antiquity, both as a category and as a worldview, its birth and history have received almost no scholarly attention. While different attitudes toward the Goy and the various ways in which the Goy can become a Jew are discussed at length in scholarship, the construction of the category itself remains almost unnoticed. I thus wish to shift the focus from the various historical attitudes toward the Goy to the very constitution of the concept and the dichotomy it constructs, so the beginning of Goyishness, if you will. I claim that there is nothing obvious about this concept or the naming it entails, and that it did not always function as an essential attribute of the self-understanding of Jews. The rabbinic Goy has no meaning outside the dyad it shares with Jew. It assumed a dualist conception of social reality in which Jews are juxtaposed with anyone else, and each member of these anyone else is a Gentile in the same sense and to the same extent. While it is a simple truism that every identity is based on difference and differentiation, there are various ways of achieving and securing the differentiation between self and others. Defining others as Gentiles is one kind of such differentiation, a result of a certain discourse that came into being at a certain moment in time, rather than a universal sociological fact, as scholars usually assume. In the Hebrew Bible, goy simply means nation, with Israel too being a goy, a holy goy indeed, but still a nation among nations. The election of Israel and its separation from the nations did not create a unified category for the nations, let alone individuals, persons, from which Israel has been separated. During the Hellenistic period, however, a semantic differentiation takes place, and goyim begins to be used mostly for foreign nations. A well-known lexicographical development was introduced by the Septuagint, which systematically distinguished between ethne, which consistently refers to foreign nations, and laos, which denotes Israel alone. The Septuagint avoids the plural laoi, using ethne for both goyim and amim, and the singular laos when referring to Israel. Even then, however, goyim were not yet used to denote individuals who were not Yehudim. The biblical term for that was nochri, stranger, allophilos, allotrios, allogenes. In the Hebrew Bible, nochri often appears in context of strangeness and otherness in general. But in biblical law, the term functioned as a group attribute, specifically denoting those who are not of Israel. And in the Deuteronomistic legislation, the nochri is opposed to your brother Israelite. This is source number 1. But even the Deuteronomistic nochri does not reach the level of the rabbinic goy. First, in Deuteronomy, the differentiation Israelite, non-Israelite is not quite binary yet, for not every individual fits into one of these two categories. Second, and most importantly, the nochri appears but 5 times in Deuteronomy and does not erase the specific distinctions between various people in categories: the land of Canaan, the 7 nations, the nations surrounding Canaan, each of which gains a different attitude. This is source number 2, Deuteronomy 23. We can thus discern in the Hebrew Bible a movement toward a generalized binary categorization, albeit one that is neither uniform nor perfect. A good case study for that is the biblical alien resident, the ger. In Deuteronomy, unlike the priestly slogan, Kager Ka'ezrach, the ger is alienated. He is contrasted with your brother and is not included in the special prohibitions imposed on Israel. Thus, he is permitted, along with the nochri, to eat from a carcass, Deuteronomy 14:21, source number 3. However, even in Deuteronomy, the ger is referred to as your ger, and unlike the nochri, is considered part of the covenant community, source number 4. He reappears there as part of the list of those who have no land, accompanying his Israelite patron on pilgrimage and receiving charity and alms from the latter. While the ger begins to become marginalized in Deuteronomy, he is not excluded yet, holding a hybrid position that distinguishes him from the nochri. The election of the holy nation in Deuteronomy does not yet stabilize the identity of all those who are not elect, nor establish a binary and comprehensive differentiation. For this to happen, one needs to wait for the birth of the goy. As is well known, the Yehudi was born during the Persian period, and yet it was not formed as a binary opposite of the biblical nochri. Already in Ezra Nehemiah and other contemporaneous works, we can discern the emergence of this new collective identity that transcends both tribe, Judah, and territory, Judea. And yet, it is not opposed by a unity, but rather by a plurality. Thus, in the book of Esther, Mordechai HaYehudi does not face some unified Gentile, but rather Haman the Agagite, every nation, their enemies, and the like. Similarly, in Ezra, and this is source number 5, The struggle against intermarriage between the Holy Seed and the people of the land presuppose a plurality along with references to specific geographical context, rather than a generic Gentiles. So too in Nehemiah, who introduced adversaries with ethnic epithets, Sanballat the Horonite, and Tuvia the Ammonite slave, and Geshem the Arab, etc. The same applies mutandis to later Second Temple compositions. Although at that stage there are both Yehudim and Nochrim, the two do not relate to a single, all-encompassing binary system, which classifies every person in the world as belonging to either of these two groups. Of course, it was possible to formulate a clear, even harsh, call for Jews to keep away from other nations before such binary categorization was stabilized. But the meaning of such separation was different. The Book of Jubilees from 2nd century BCE advocates a sharp and total distinction based on an ontological and metaphysical uniqueness of Israel. But it is mostly a distinction from Goyim, nations in the plural, and the differences between these nations remain significant. Thus, Jubilees 22, this is source 6, present an ideology of total separation of the seed of Jacob from the nations, most likely ruling out their conversion as well, but does not yet employ a category that encompasses all these nations. It thus cobbles together idolaters, the people of Canaan, and the Sodomites in order to substantiate the prohibition. There is no collective name for all those others whom Jews ought to avoid. Scholars note a few precedents for Second Temple writers' use of goyim or ethne as referring to a non-distinct group of individuals. They refer specifically to two adjacent verses from the Damascus Covenant that regulate relations between individuals rather than nations. No one should, and this is source 7, no one should stay in a place close to the goyim on the Shabbat, and no one should sell clean animals and birds to the goyim lest they sacrifice them. The second case is especially interesting, for the line before that reads, he is not to stretch out his hand to shed the blood of one of the goyim, ish mina goyim, for the sake of riches and gain. Goyim is here thus a kind of shorthand for a person of the goyim, once the individualistic context has been established. To these, one should add several references to ethne in the context of local enemies in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. These occurrences prove that the new meaning, the new individualistic meaning of goyim or ethne, is neither a Qumranic neologism, nor is it restricted to Hebrew alone. They indicate that sometimes in the 2nd and 1st century BCE it became possible to use ethne as well as goyim in a way that is both generalized and open to individuation. These two processes are related. Ignoring the differences between various nations could have eased the usage of the term in indeterminate cases in which group of individuals rather than ethnic collectives are concerned. The exceptional nature of this new use is proven by comparison to Philo and Josephus, who never use ethne in this new meaning. The hundreds of times they use this term all maintain its old biblical meaning of peoples. Moreover, ethne in 1st and 2nd Maccabees are still whole political in nature, in both compositions. Take, for example, 1st Maccabees chapter 5. This is source number 8. And the ethne that were in Galad assembled themselves together against the Israelites that were in the quarter to destroy them. And they fled into the fortress of the Tema. And they sent letters to Judas and his brothers, saying, the ethne that are round about assembled together against us to destroy us. On this verse, Heron Harrington note, ta ethne en ta galad must refer to Gentiles, meaning to individuals rather than to nations. But, as such vouch shows, the nation roundabout, Hagoyim Saviv, ta ethne en kiklu auton, is a biblical phrase referring to the nations which circle Judea. The fact that the author interpret the gathering of the ethne in Galad as an assembly of the nations roundabout does not leave much doubt as to the national context, the political context of First Maccabees ethne, even when specific local enemies rather than whole nations are referred to. Furthermore, the repetitive pedantic obsession with the need for differentiation between Jews and non-Jews in jubilees and other compositions from this period might indicate a world in which such separation is still a matter of constant struggle, and the boundaries are not yet clear-cut. In Tannaitic literature, on the other hand, the border is already clear and the distinction is taken as a given. This is indeed the first corpus, the Tannaitic is the first corpus in which the singular form goy is used to denote a single person. This is an apt expression of the completion of a process in which the collective noun that used to denote peoples and nations came to denote every single individual who does not belong to one nation, which, with the specific actual ethnicity of that person being completely irrelevant. The biblical goyim became generalized and abstracted and at the same time individualized. It is not simply a shift in the meaning of a word that we witness in the Tannaitic literature. Being consistent and pervasive, this shift is a marker of a whole new discursive formation. Within this formation, the imperative to separate and control interaction with the non-Jew is not meant to establish separation, but is already based on it. From the fact of separation, one draws a whole set of rules of conduct. Furthermore, the stabilization of the Jew-Goy distinction as binary system went along with the systematic effort to eliminate various hybrid identities that existed in previous discourses and to locate them within one of these two categories. Thus, the Ger became a proselyte, a Jew in all regards, while the alien resident, the biblical Ger Toshav in rabbinic terminology, is marginalized to the point that both Talmuds can actually compare him to a Goy in every respect, Kegoy lechol dvarav. The God-fearers, Yerei Shamayim, are now considered Gentiles. Samaritans become questionable Jews, cast by the Mishnah beside the Shtuki and the Sufi, who do not know the identity of their fathers. Slaves become second-tier members of the Jewish community, along with women and minors. Tannaitic law insists on placing hybrid individuals on one of these two poles, erecting between them a border that includes well-guarded crossing points. This is also the significance of the appearance of the conversion ceremony in rabbinic literature as an agent of ontological transformation that takes place at once. A convert who immersed and rose from the pool is a Jew in all regards, Bavli Evamot. This is the ceremony that serves as a new gate in a recently erected wall. So, starting our research under the impression of the clear difference between biblical and rabbinic use of goy, we first ascribe the birth of the Goy to the Tannaitic revolution after the destruction of the Second Temple. Noting the frequent mentions of ethne in the epistles of Paul, we thought at first that it represented nothing more than an interesting example of the stages preceding the rabbinic dichotomous model. A closer inspection, however, revealed Paul to be a more perplexing and complex and interesting case, an explication of which will drive the remainder of this paper. Paul makes extensive use of ethne in his letters, mainly in Romans and Galatians. He mentions the term 45 times, much more than any other collective designation. Some of these refer explicitly to his addressees, but many other unspecified occurrences of ethne can also be understood only when assuming Paul's specific mission to his communities. I speak to you, ethne, he declares in Romans 11:13. This is source 9, adding, in as much then as I'm an apostle to the ethne. Elsewhere, he addresses his congregation in Corinth with the words, when you were ethne. This is source 10. Even when speaking about rather than to Gentiles, he often implicates his addressees, meaning his individual addressees, right, rather than collective nations, etc. Individualized context is apparent when Paul complains that Peter compels the ethne to live as Jews, Galatians 2:14, or when he described the ethne who fulfill the law although they have no law. This is Romans 2:14. It is also evident when ethne is paralleled with uncircumcised, as in Romans 3 and Galatians 2. This is source 11. When biblical verses on Goyim are cited or paraphrased, they are also applied by Paul to his own congregation, as in the Catena in Romans 15. This is source 12. Other occurrences also make sense only if referring to groups of individuals. And here comes a list which I will spare you. In fact, only very few cases can be reasonably read as referring to nations, exclusively according to the old biblical sense of the term. Paul, as we've seen, is not the first to present Gentiles as a unified category. He is also not the first to privatize this corporate body by using ethne to denote individual goyim. But in two of his letters, the generalized individualized ethne are no longer passing references, episodic usages of a word that slowly changed its meaning along with other terms like Am Haaretz and Israel, which also came to designate kind of individuals rather than collectives. Rather, ethne had become marker of bigger discursive shift. Paul mentions them at the critical junctures of Romans and Galatians: his mission, the death of Jesus, the law, ethics, and redemption. He also presents the term in a sense that is unprecedentedly independent of the biblical ethnic context by cutting off the ethne to whom he appeals from their ethnic origin. His generalized and privatized appeal to the ethne erases ethnic distinction between the different groups that he is approaching, in contrast not only to the biblical heritage, but also to contemporary Jewish writings. He took a marginal use, radicalized it, and made it into a core of his thought. He was, in other words, the first author we know of to systematically capitalize on the possibilities which the shift in the meaning of ethne opens. It is this specific move that is not to be found in Qumran, in the books of Maccabees, or to the best of our knowledge, in any other pre-Pauline composition. Many recent scholars accept the claim that Paul addresses his letter to non-Jews only, rather than to mixed Jewish-Gentile congregation, and that the theological issue he is grappling with is the ability of non-Jews to enter into Israelite history without adopting Jewish ancestral practices. Paul's problem is how to bring Gentiles into the Jewish Heilsgeschichte, which begins with election and ends with redemption. It thus should not be surprising that it is in his letters that the category functions discursively, probably for the first time, as the Gentiles become the core of an entire theological formation. An indication for this novelty may be found in the effort Paul invests in establishing this distinction, explicitly modeling it, as Romans 1:14-16 shows. This is source number 13, the last one, on the Greek barbarian distinction. Another indication for the novelty may be drawn for his recurring translation effort of the biblical ethne to the Christ believers to whom he himself appeals. Thus, in Romans 15, Paul cites a catena of verses discussing the ethne joining the praise of God while applying them to the member of the community in Rome. This translation effort is most apparent in verses such as Galatians 3:8-9, where after the citations of Genesis 12, all ethne will be blessed through you, he explicitly adds an explanation that brings the point home. So, oste, those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. The other side of addressing Romans, Galatians, or Corinthians as Gentiles is the total lack of interest in the bewildering ethnic diversity of the native population of Asia Minor. All the sources mentioned above, in which we've found episodic use of goyim or ethne that necessitates or is open to individualized reading, are still concerned with specific nations and their particular characteristic. Only Paul, the great traveler who took constant pain in communicating with each community according to its specific conditions and problems, who was all things to all people, failed to acknowledge their ethnic cultural differences, and instead treated his addressees, whether straightforwardly or implicitly, as Gentiles. This new conceptualization is tightly connected to Paul's unprecedented project of creating a new universal ecclesia. Paul was not the first to preach to non-Jews and conceived this as a mission. Otherwise, how was the ecclesia in Rome established? A practice which perhaps originated at the community in Antioch, if Acts is to be believed. But if there were other preachers who conceived themselves as apostles to the Gentiles, dedicated from the womb to do that and only that, they left no trace in our archives. Paul was probably also the first known author to supply a systematic justification and reflection to this practice in reaction to growing oppositions. Our claim is thus that Paul letters are the textual site for the first known appearance of a new discursive formation in which a generalized, individualized category of Gentile serve as a key element for a whole conceptual constellation. In what follows, I shall attempt to reconstruct very briefly the discursive conditions and form of reasoning underlying Paul's new formation. Reflecting on Paul's binary ethnic thinking, Christopher Stanley offered a sharp description of its historical and cultural context. The Apostle Paul, now a citation, the Apostle Paul grew up in a multi-ethnic environment and spent much of his adult life traveling and working among people representing a wide range of ethnic background and identities. It is not surprising to note how circumscribed is the language that he uses in his letter when speaking of ethnic differences. Though he varies his term from passage to passage, Paul consistently defined ethnicity in binary terms. For him, the world is divided into Judaioi and non-Judaioi, commonly described as ta'etne, the nations. That's the end of Stanley's passage. Stanley proposes to relate this strange phenomenon to the local rhetorical effect the binary language might have had on Paul's listeners, especially in erasing inter-ethnic tensions or easing inter-ethnic tensions within his churches. While I'm in full agreement with Stanley's depiction of the rhetorical phenomenon, I wish to propose here a different interpretation of it. Paul turns to non-Jews and demands that they cease their own ancestral worship and turn their backs on their gods, a demand which, at least according to Luke, meets with much disapproval. A Greek, an Egyptian, or a Scythian who join the ecclesia cannot simply transfer one ethnic god to another. The Greeks who are baptized in Christ must abandon their ethnic gods and are left without a new one. The God of Israel is an ethnic God, but not theirs. Thus, the Greeks do not join the ecclesia as Israelite, but cannot join as Greeks either, since joining the community cancels ethnic differences. This scandal was well formulated by Paula Fredriksson. Since, and this is a quote, since they were neither proselyte nor God-fearers, they fit no previously known social category, not requiring complete affiliation with Judaism via circumcision, insisting nonetheless that native cult be renounced. The early apostles walked these Christ-fearing pagans into a social and religious no man's land. End of quote. I claim that it is this no man's land that stimulated the formation of the Goyim, a middle ground between Paul's cosmopolitanism and his insistence on keeping the Jewish identity intact. The Greek cannot join the ecclesia as a Greek, a category which has no theological meaning and no significance in the history of salvation, nor as a universal human, a category that Paul, who relies on the biblical narrative, cannot grasp, nor as a Jew, since he was not circumcised. Other traditional tracts discussed by scholars such as God-fearers or the eschatological pilgrimage models are not good enough for Paul too, since he wants new believers to be integral members of the ecclesia and not an appendix to it. Paul insists that the new believers become an integral part of the community of a God that was still the God of Israel, without, however, becoming Jews. The result is that a Greek can join the ecclesia only as a goy. Indeed, Paul says so much at the very opening of Romans. I have often intended to come to you in order that I may reap some harvest among you, as I have among the rest of the ethne. He does not address here or anywhere else in this epistle the Romans qua Romans. Instead, he tells them that he turns to them because they are Gentiles. And he, as the apostle to the Gentiles, is committed to all Gentiles equally. Traditionally, scholars read Hellenes, Greeks, as similar to ethne in Paul's letters, or at least to the ethne that Paul is involved with in Asia Minor. But more recently, more care was given to the rhetorical effect of this use of ethne in his epistles. The most critical factor in this regard is that Paul refers to Hellenes always and only in contrast, usually to Jews and once to barbarian. Let's look once again at source 13, and this is the last passage. The very opening of Romans, as Caroline Johnson Hodge meticulously shows, in verse 14, Paul uses the traditional distinction between Greeks and barbarian as a tool to introduce the only distinction that matters, theologically speaking, that between Jews and non-Jews. As he explicitly put it in verse 16, it is the power of God for salvation for everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. The Greek, representing the superior ethnos, the best of ethne, Tov Shebagoim, appears here as inferior to the Jew. The Hellenistic hierarchy is deliberately subjugated to the Jewish one, according to which Greek is no different, again theologically speaking, from barbarian. Thus, Paul does not create a universal person here, since his division depends on the biblical narrative of election. But he does create a universal goy, an individualized, generalized category that applies to any person but the Jew.